Jackson Miller thought he could bury his past in the lonely mountains of Montana. But when a battered wolf dog collapses on his porch, bearing a scarred ear and a silver tag from 30 years ago, the ghosts of his father's death come screaming back to life. How could this loyal creature survive 3 decades in the wilderness just to find him? What lethal secret is hidden beneath that silver fur that men are willing to kill for? And can a broken Smokejumper face the flames one last time to save a soul he thought was lost forever? The answers lie deep within the devil's finger. Please support our storytelling journey by subscribing to the channel. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. Returns from the Dead. The wind did not just blow against the cabin, it screamed. Jackson Miller sat by the hearth. He watched the orange flames dance in a slow and rhythmic trance. To the rest of the world, he was Jax, a man of few words, a shadow in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. But inside Jax was a man trapped in a burning forest that no longer existed. He could still smell the bitter scent of pine needles turning to ash. He could still feel the heat of the firestorm that had claimed his team many years ago. He was a smokejumper who had forgotten how to land. The guilt was a heavy and cold weight in his chest. It lived there. It breathed there. Suddenly a sound cut through the howling blizzard. It was not the wind. It was a rhythmic and desperate scratching against the heavy oak of the front door. Jax did not move at first. He thought his mind was playing tricks again. Then came a low and mournful whine. It was a sound of absolute exhaustion. He stood up. His knees popped in the quiet room. He reached for the iron bolt and slid it back. The door flew open as the storm forced its way inside. A massive and shivering shape tumbled across the threshold. It was a dog, or perhaps a wolf. The creature was a hybrid of silver and charcoal fur. It was matted with frozen blood and caked in ice. Jax slammed the door shut against the white wall of snow. He knelt beside the animal. His hands reached out with the practiced calm of a medic. The dog was large, a powerful Malamute mix, but he was skeletal. Deep lacerations ran across his flanks. These were not the marks of a mountain lion. These were the angry and jagged scars of wire, of human cruelty. Jax felt a surge of cold anger. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the sofa. He wrapped the shivering animal carefully. The dog opened its eyes. They were a pale and haunting amber. There was no aggression in that gaze, only a deep and ancient recognition. Jax froze. He reached out to touch the animal's head. His fingers brushed against the left ear. He felt the jagged notch, a perfect and distinctive V-shaped scar. Jax felt the air leave his lungs. It cannot be, he whispered to the empty room. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He searched the thick and matted fur around the dog's neck. His fingers found a leather strap. It was cracked and ancient. He pulled the brass tag into the light of the fire. The metal was tarnished, but the engraving was still clear. It read, "Sam's Legacy, Montana." Jax fell back against the floorboards. This was Buster. The dog had been a pup when Jax was just a boy. He remembered his father, Sam Miller, placing the small ball of fur into his arms. That was 3 decades ago. Buster had disappeared shortly after Sam Miller died in the mountains. Jax had mourned them both. He had buried the memory of that dog along with his father. But here he was. The dog was far too old. He should have been long gone. Yet the wolf blood in him had granted him a terrifying longevity. Buster let out a soft and rattling breath. He nudged Jax's hand with a cold nose. It was a plea, a final mission. Jax noticed a bulge beneath the leather collar. He worked his knife carefully. He cut through a secondary strap hidden by the fur. A small and cylindrical container fell onto the rug. It was made of industrial plastic. It was waterproof and sealed with wax. Jax cracked it open. Inside was a heavy fragment of white quartz. It was shot through with veins of raw and glittering gold. Along with the stone was a scrap of parchment. The handwriting was shaky. It was the script of a man facing the end. Jackson, if you find this, Buster has done the impossible. Caleb has found the vein. He will not let me leave. I am at the finger. Help me finish what your father started. Thomas. Jax looked at the gold. Then he looked at the dying fire. Thomas Sterling, his father's best friend. The man who had disappeared into the wilderness long ago. The Devil's Finger was a jagged spire of rock 10 miles to the north. It was a place of unstable cliffs and deadly chutes. In this weather, it was a tomb. Jax looked at Buster. The dog had traveled through a literal hell to find him. He had carried the weight of the past across miles of frozen peaks. Jax felt the old fear rising. To go to the finger meant entering the heart of the storm. It meant facing the very mountains that had swallowed his father. But he looked at the V-shaped scar on the dog's ear. He remembered his father's voice. We never leave a partner behind, Jax. The guilt that had paralyzed him for many seasons began to shift. It was no longer just a weight. It was a spark. Jax stood up. His movements were no longer slow. He moved to the gun cabinet. He checked his rifle. He packed his emergency gear, extra rations, medical supplies. He knelt one last time beside Buster. He placed his hand on the dog's rhythmic and shallow chest. Rest now, old friend, Jax said. His voice was thick with emotion. You did your part. I will do the rest. He stoked the fire one last time. He piled the logs high so the cabin would stay warm for the dog. Then he stepped out into the white roar of the night. The wind tried to push him back. The cold tried to bite through his skin. But Jax Miller did not stop. He was no longer a ghost hiding from the flames. He was a son going to settle a debt. The mountains were waiting. And for the first time in a decade, Jax was ready to fight back. Chapter 2. The Call of Bloodline. The interior of the cabin felt smaller now. Jackson Miller did not move with the hesitation of a hermit. He moved with the precision of a soldier preparing for a drop. He pulled his heavy canvas pack from the cedar closet. The fabric was worn but sturdy. It smelled of old wood smoke and dried pine. He checked his gear with rhythmic efficiency. He packed high-calorie rations and thermal blankets. He checked the seal on his first aid kit. He slid his climbing harness over his hips. The nylon webbing felt familiar. It felt like a second skin. Jax looked at the corner where Buster lay. The old dog had stopped shivering. His breathing was deeper now, more stable. But as Jax reached for his cross-country skis, the dog's head lifted. Those amber eyes were fixed on the door. You need to stay, Buster, Jax whispered. You have done enough. Buster did not listen. The animal forced himself onto his paws. His legs wobbled, his muscles protested, but the spirit inside that silver frame was iron. He limped to the door. He stood there with a quiet and terrifying resolve. Jax saw the truth then. This was not a pet following a master. This was a guide waiting for his student. He opened the door. The blizzard had settled into a steady and heavy fall. The world was a canvas of pure white. Jax stepped into his ski bindings. He chose skis over a snowmobile for a reason. Silence was his only ally. A motor would echo for miles in this valley. It would announce his arrival to anyone watching. and Jax knew someone was watching. They began the ascent. Buster did not run. He moved with a steady and limping gait that devoured the distance. The dog possessed an uncanny intelligence. He did not follow the obvious trails. He wound through the dense clusters of subalpine fir. Every few miles, Buster would stop. He would stand perfectly still beside a specific tree or a jagged rock. Jax noticed the markings then. They were old notches in the bark, faded paint on the granite. These were the exact national forest boundary markers his father had established many years ago. Sam Miller had walked these lines during a long and forgotten summer. The dog was following a map etched in memory and scent. Jax felt a lump form in his throat. The mountain was talking to him through the paws of an animal he thought was dead. As they climbed higher, the air grew thin and biting. Jax stopped to catch his breath. He looked down at Buster's trail. He saw how the dog had come down the mountain earlier. The tracks were frantic, wide. He realized then how Buster had escaped. Thomas and the dog must have waited for the exact moment the storm hit. Caleb would have been distracted. He would have been busy securing the camp or the gear. The blizzard was a curtain. Thomas must have shoved Buster into the white abyss. He must have told him to run. The dog had chosen to find Jax instead of simply surviving. They reached a high ridge overlooking a narrow canyon. Buster suddenly flattened his body against the snow. He let out a very low and vibrating growl. Jax dropped low. He crawled to the edge of the limestone shelf. He pulled a pair of high-powered binoculars from his chest rig. Below them, tucked into a fold of the mountain, was a small and modern structure. It was a prefabricated shed. It looked out of place in this wild cathedral. High on a nearby pole, a small device rotated slowly. Jax recognized the shape. It was a high-end thermal imaging camera. It scanned the slopes for body heat. It looked for anything moving in the cold. Caleb isn't just a hunter, Jax thought. This was a surveillance station. If Jax continued on the main slope, the sensors would pick him up in seconds. He looked at the vertical face of the Devil's Finger. It was a wall of black ice and jagged obsidian. It was the only blind spot. Jax looked at his hands. They were scarred from years of fire and hard labor. He felt a sudden wave of doubt. Buster walked over to him. The dog nudged Jax's hand. Then, with a gentle and deliberate motion, Buster licked the long white scar on Jax's wrist. The sensation was warm, grounding. It was a reminder. Jax had survived the fire. He could survive the ice. "I hear you, partner," Jax whispered. He began to climb. He bypassed the sensors by going straight up the frozen waterfall. He hammered his ice tools into the blue glaze. The sound of the metal striking ice was muffled by the wind. His muscles burned. His lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. But every time he looked down, he saw Buster waiting patiently on a small ledge. The dog's presence was a tether to the world of the living. Halfway up the cliff, Jax found a small cavern. Inside were several heavy plastic crates. They were marked with industrial logos. He pried one open. He did not find mining equipment. He found legal documents, land surveys. Jax read the bold print on a site plan. Caleb did not care about the gold quartz. Not really. The gold was just the proof of mineral wealth. With that proof, Caleb could invoke old industrial land rights. He could strip the protection from the entire wilderness. He wanted to build a massive processing plant, a road network. He wanted to turn this sanctuary into a scar on the earth. Jax felt a cold and righteous fury. This was what his father had died to prevent. The mountain was not just a place of beauty. It was a legacy. He looked out over the valley. The snow was falling harder now. He could see the dim glow of a light further up the trail. Thomas was there, alone. Jax tightened his harness. He checked his rifle one last time. The fear was gone. The Smokejumper was back. He signaled to Buster. The dog stood up. His amber eyes caught the faint light of the moon. They moved together into the heart of the finger. The hunt had changed. Jax Miller was no longer the one being followed. He was the storm, and he was coming for everything Caleb tried to steal. Chapter 3. Prisoner of Greed. The air at the summit of the Devil's Finger was thin enough to bruise the lungs. Jackson Miller stayed low to the frozen earth. He followed the silver shadow of Buster through a labyrinth of jagged rocks. The storm was fading into a ghostly mist. Suddenly, Buster stopped. The dog moved toward a massive wall of ancient pine trees. Their branches were heavy with a century of growth and thick layers of fresh snow. Jax watched as Buster nudged a specific cluster of dead limbs. They were not part of the living trees. They had been placed there by a human hand. It was a masterpiece of camouflage. Jax reached out and pulled back a curtain of frozen needles. Hidden beneath the brush was the yawning mouth of an old mine shaft. The wooden support beams were gray and weathered. They looked like the ribs of a giant beast buried in the mountain. A faint and flickering orange light pulsed from deep within the earth. Jax unslung his rifle. He checked the action with a slow and silent motion. He looked at Buster. "Stay behind me," he whispered. The dog responded with a low and steady gaze. He stepped into the darkness with a predator's grace. The interior of the mine smelled of damp stone and kerosene. As Jax crept further into the tunnel, the silence was broken by a voice. It was a harsh and jagged sound. "You are a stubborn old fool, Thomas." Jax pressed his back against the cold stone wall. He peered around a rusted iron ore car. A cavern opened up at the end of the shaft. Thomas Sterling sat on a wooden crate. His hands were bound behind his back with thick nylon rope. He looked fragile. His white hair was matted with dirt, but his eyes were like flint. Standing over him was Caleb. Caleb held a tattered geological map in one hand and a heavy iron tool in the other. "The coordinates, Thomas. Just read them for me," Caleb said. His voice was trembling with a dangerous edge. Thomas spat on the dusty floor. "I have spent my life protecting this mountain from men like you. Caleb, I am not going to stop now." Caleb leaned in close. He tapped the map against Thomas's chest. "You think you are a hero? You think my father was a villain for dying poor?" Caleb paced the floor. His boots made a rhythmic crunching sound on the gravel. "The Sterling name used to mean something in this state. Now it means nothing. I grew up in the shadow of this wilderness while other men got rich off the land." He stopped and turned. His face was twisted with a desperate greed. "This gold, this land, it is my inheritance. The world owes me this. You owe me this." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Greed has made you blind, Caleb. This is not about wealth. It is about a promise I made to Sam Miller." Thomas looked toward the dark mouth of the tunnel. It was as if he could feel the presence of the man who had come to save him. "Rio, I know I am not leaving this mountain alive," Thomas said quietly. "But you will never find that vein. Only a miller can read that map." Caleb let out a short and bitter laugh. "The Miller boy is a ghost. He is hiding in a cabin because he is afraid of a little smoke." Jax felt a surge of cold fury. He reached into his tactical vest. His fingers wrapped around a small and heavy cylinder, a flashbang. He looked at Buster. The dog's ears were flat. His muscles were coiled like a spring. Jax pulled the pin. He counted to 3. Then he tossed the device into the center of the cavern. A blinding white explosion of light filled the mine. It was followed immediately by a massive and concussive shockwave that rattled the timber supports. Caleb let out a cry of pain. He clutched his eyes. "Now!" Jax yelled. Buster launched himself across the cavern. The dog was a blur of silver fur. He did not go for the throat. He went for Caleb's right arm. The dog's jaws locked onto Caleb's wrist with a terrifying strength. The heavy iron tool fell to the ground with a dull thud. Jax charged into the light. He did not use his rifle. The space was too tight. He tackled Caleb away from Thomas. They hit the ground hard. Caleb was younger and fueled by a panicked rage. He threw a heavy punch that caught Jax in the ribs. Jax gritted his teeth. He felt a sharp pain, but he did not let go. He threw Caleb against a stack of wooden crates. The wood splintered. In the chaos, a row of old kerosene lanterns was knocked from a shelf. Glass shattered against the stone. The smell of raw fuel immediately filled the cramped air. Jax saw a small flame dancing on the edge of a spilled pool of oil. The fire began to grow. It was reaching toward several old canisters of pressurized gas used for the mining torches. "Thomas, get out!" Jax shouted. He grabbed Caleb by the collar, but Caleb lunged for the map on the floor. "It is mine," Caleb screamed. The struggle became a frantic scramble in the dirt. Buster circled them. His low and vibrating growl echoed against the cave walls. The air was becoming thick with the scent of burning kerosene. Jax looked at the growing flame. He saw the orange light reflecting in Thomas's terrified eyes. The past was repeating itself. The smoke, the heat, the feeling of being trapped. But this time, Jax was not going to run. He kicked the map away from Caleb's reach. He grabbed Thomas's bound arms and pulled him toward the exit. The gas canisters began to hiss. The sound was a high and terrifying whistle. Jax knew they had seconds before the cavern became a furnace. He looked back at Caleb. The man was still clawing at the dirt for a piece of paper. "Caleb, leave it." But greed had already consumed the man's mind. Jax turned his back on the fire. He pushed Thomas toward the tunnel entrance where Buster was already waiting. The mine groaned. A heavy beam cracked. The final battle for the Devil's Finger had begun. Chapter 4. Rescue in the Heart of the Fire. The high-pitched whistle of the gas canisters reached a terrifying peak. Then, the world turned white. A massive explosion of gas and dust ripped through the center of the mine shaft. The force of the blast threw Jax Miller backward against the uneven stone wall. The heavy mountain groaned above them. A rhythmic series of deep booms echoed as the ancient timber supports began to splinter. Dust choked the air. Huge sections of the ceiling gave way. Rocks and debris fell like rain into the central cavern. Through the haze, a sharp and agonizing cry of pain cut through the chaos. Jax blinked away the soot. He looked toward the center of the room. Caleb was trapped. A massive boulder of white quartz had fallen from the roof. It had pinned Caleb's right leg firmly against the dirt floor. Caleb clawed at the stone with bloodied fingernails. His face was a mask of pure terror. The spilled kerosene had finally found the spark it needed. A wall of orange flames began to roar along the floor. The fire climbed the remaining wooden beams with a hungry and rhythmic crackling sound. Jax felt the heat hit his face. The smell of burning pine and chemicals filled his nose. Suddenly, the cavern disappeared. In Jax's mind, he was no longer in the mine. He was back in the moment of the great firestorm that claimed his team. He saw the faces of his fallen teammates through the shimmering heat. He heard the roar of the crown fire leaping from tree to tree. His muscles locked. His breath became a jagged and shallow gasp. Jackson Miller, the brave Smokejumper, was frozen in time. Jax, look at me!" Thomas Sterling was shouting from the tunnel entrance. The old man had managed to crawl toward the exit. He held a thick bundle of files against his chest. "The mine is going down. Jax, grab the bag and leave him." Thomas pointed toward the screaming man beneath the rock. "He is not worth saving. Jax, he is a monster. Save yourself." The fire was growing. The heat was becoming an unbearable weight. Jax looked at Caleb. The younger man's eyes met his. There was no more greed in those eyes, only the primal plea of a human being facing a terrible end. Buster moved into the light. The dog stood beside Jax. He let out a low and steady whine. Buster did not run for the exit. He stood his ground in the heat. The dog looked at Jax. Then he looked at the man trapped under the stone. In that moment, the ghosts of the past faded. Jax did not see his dead friends as a reason to hide. He saw them as a reason to act. He remembered his father's voice from many years ago, a voice of steady calm. "Sam Miller did not teach me to leave anyone behind in the flames." The words were a vow. Jax moved. He did not run for the exit. He ran toward the fire. He reached into his tactical pack. His fingers wrapped around the cold steel of a portable hydraulic spreader. It was a tool built for this exact nightmare. "Buster, to me!" Jax yelled. The dog lunged forward. Jax jammed the steel teeth of the spreader into the narrow gap beneath the quartz boulder. He began to pump the handle with a rhythmic and desperate force. The metal groaned under the pressure. The boulder began to lift. Just an inch. Then 2. Caleb was sobbing. He was trying to pull his crushed leg free. "It is not enough," Jax cried out. The ceiling above them let out a loud and final snap of breaking wood. Buster saw the struggle. The dog moved to the other side of the rock. He dug his powerful paws into the dirt. Buster wedged his thick shoulder beneath the secondary timber that was helping hold the rock. The animal strained with a strength that seemed impossible. His muscles knotted beneath his silver fur. Together. The man and the dog fought the mountain. The spreader hissed. The rock shifted. "Now pull!" Caleb gave one final and desperate heave. He dragged his mangled leg clear of the stone. Jax did not waste a second. He grabbed Caleb by the back of his heavy coat. He threw the man's arm over his shoulder. "Buster, go!" They turned and ran. The heat was a physical wall at their backs. They scrambled through the narrow tunnel just as the main cavern collapsed. The sound of the final cave-in was like 1,000 cannons firing at once. The air pressure from the collapse blew them forward. They tumbled out of the mine entrance and into the freezing night. Jax hit the snow hard. He rolled onto his back. He took deep and frantic gulps of the cold Montana air. Black smoke billowed from the mine entrance behind them. It stained the white snow like a dark ink. Thomas was there. He was kneeling in the drifts. He was holding the files. Buster stood over Jax. The dog was covered in soot and ash, but his amber eyes were bright. Jax looked up at the stars. The roar of the fire was gone. The screaming in his mind had finally stopped. He had gone back into the heart of the flames, and this time, he had brought everyone home. The greatest psychological demon of his life lay buried under the rubble of the Devil's Finger. Jackson Miller was no longer a ghost. He was a man who had survived. He reached out and buried his hand in Buster's thick and smoky fur. The dog leaned into the touch. They stayed there in the silence of the snow, safe and finally free. Chapter 5. The Final Awakening. The cold air of the Montana night felt like a blessing against Jackson Miller's scorched skin. He sat in the deep snow just a few yards from the smoking ruins of the mine. Beside him, Caleb lay flat on his back. The younger man was trembling violently. It was not just the cold of the mountain. It was the total collapse of his reality. Caleb looked at Jax. His eyes were wide and filled with a frantic, haunting confusion. "Why did you do it?" Caleb's voice was a ragged whisper. It was a sound of absolute defeat. "I was going to leave you in that hole. I was going to kill you, Jax Miller." Jax did not look away. He kept his hand firmly on Buster's shoulder. The dog was breathing heavily. His silver fur was dusted with gray ash. "My father taught me that life is not a calculation," Jax said quietly. "You don't save people because they are good. You save them because they are breathing." Caleb let out a short and sobbing breath. The weight of his own greed seemed to crush him more than the stone ever could. He realized then that the man he called a coward was the only reason his heart was still beating. He reached into the inner lining of his heavy winter coat. His fingers were clumsy and numb. He pulled out a small and tarnished brass key. It hung from a dirty piece of twine. "The safe," Caleb gasped. He coughed as the smoke in his lungs protested. "In the basement of the old ranger station, at the trailhead. It is all in there." He pressed the key into Jax's hand. "The contracts, the payoff records, the names of the council members who signed the land away. I kept them for leverage, but now, I just want them gone." Caleb's eyes began to flutter. His body was finally surrendering to the trauma and the exhaustion. "Tell my uncle, I am sorry," he whispered. Then, Caleb's head fell to the side as he lost consciousness. Jax looked at Thomas Sterling. The old man was sitting on a nearby log. He was clutching the bundle of files to his chest, like a holy relic. He finally woke up. "Jax," Thomas said. His voice was thick with a weary relief. Jax looked at the old man. The questions that had burned in his mind for 3 decades finally demanded an answer. "Why did you wait so long? Thomas, why let me believe Buster was gone? Why let me live in the dark about my father's work?" Thomas looked up at the stars. The sky was clear now. The storm had done its job. "Because of the day your father died," Thomas began slowly. "Your father, Sam Miller, found out the truth about the mining conglomerate. He found out they weren't just looking for gold. They wanted to strip the entire valley for minerals." Thomas leaned forward. His eyes were filled with an ancient sorrow. But the people involved were powerful. They weren't just thugs like Caleb. They were men in suits. Men who could make people disappear. Jax felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow, and Sam knew they were coming for him. Thomas continued. "He knew he couldn't win that fight alone, but he looked at you. You were just a boy. He told me that if he went public then, they would use you to get to him." Jax felt his heart stop. "So he made a choice," Thomas said. "He hid the evidence. He sent Buster away with me to the high country. He stayed behind to draw their attention. He sacrificed his reputation and his life to buy you time." Jax looked down at Buster. The dog let out a low and mournful sound. He leaned his heavy head against Jax's knee. "Sam's plan was a long game. Jax, he wanted you to grow up. He wanted you to become the man you are now. A man who knows how to fight. A man who can protect the truth." Jax realized the truth then. His father hadn't died in an accident. He had died in a war. A silent war for the soul of the Montana wilderness. Buster was the keeper of the key, Thomas said. Sam trained him to find you when the time was right, when the threat was real again. Jax felt the hot sting of tears against his cold cheeks. 3 decades of wandering, many years of feeling like he had lost everything, but he hadn't lost anything. He had been protected. The dog had carried his father's love through long years of silence. The morning light began to creep over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots. Jax helped Thomas stand up. Together, they began the long walk down the mountain. They carried Caleb between them. The walk was slow, but Jax's heart felt light for the first time in a decade. When they reached the trailhead, the authorities were already there. Caleb did not fight them, true to his word. He began to speak. He gave the names, he gave the locations, he confessed to every betrayal. Redemption is a long road. But Caleb had finally taken the first step. Jax stood by the ranger station as the investigators opened the safe. He watched as the documents were pulled out into the sunlight, the records of corruption, the illegal land grants, the names of the men who thought they owned the mountain. The shadows that had hung over the Miller name for 3 decades were finally dissolving. The documents confirmed everything Thomas had said. Sam Miller had been the guardian of the Bitterroots. And now, his son was standing in his place. Jax turned to Buster. The dog was sitting in the back of Jax's truck. He was tired. His silver muzzle was gray with age, but his eyes were peaceful. The mission was over. Jax climbed into the driver's seat. He reached over and scratched Buster behind his scarred ear. "Let's go home." "Buster," Jax said. The truck engine started with a steady and rhythmic hum. They drove away from the Devil's Finger. The mountains stayed behind them. It was silent and magnificent. The wilderness was safe, and for the first time in his life, Jackson Miller knew exactly who he was. Chapter 6. Honor Restored. The sterile hallways of the Missoula Hospital felt worlds away from the frozen peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. Jackson Miller sat in a hard plastic chair beside Thomas Sterling's bed. The morning sun filtered through the window. It cast long and warm rectangles across the linoleum floor. Thomas looked frail beneath the white sheets, but the hollow look in his eyes had disappeared. He reached toward the bedside table. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up a small and weathered book. It was bound in dark leather. The edges were frayed and stained by many seasons of mountain rain and campfire smoke. "I have carried this since the day your father asked me to keep it safe," Thomas said. His voice was a soft and rhythmic rasp. "He told me it was the only thing that truly mattered." He handed the book to Jax. Jax felt the weight of the leather in his palms. He opened the first page. It was his father's field journal. The pages were filled with detailed geological sketches and mountain coordinates. But as Jax flipped through the back entries, the technical notes disappeared. They were replaced by personal reflections written in a bold and steady hand. Jax stopped at a page written during a quiet summer long ago. Today, Jackson stood his ground against a mother black bear to protect a wounded hawk. He did not blink. He is only 8, but he has the heart of a lion. I have never been more proud of the man he is becoming. Jax felt a sharp and sudden pang in his chest. He read another entry from the final year of his father's life. The threats are getting louder, but when I look at my son, I know why I am fighting. He has a courage that is pure. He is the best of us. Jax closed his eyes. For 10 years, he had lived with the crushing belief that he was a failure. He had seen himself as a coward who survived when others did not. But here, in the faded ink of a dead man's journal, was the truth. His father had seen his strength long before Jax ever wore a Smokejumper's uniform. The internal wounds that had bled for a decade began to close. Jax was not a ghost of a tragedy. He was the living legacy of a hero's pride. Outside the hospital room, the world was changing. The documents from Caleb's safe had acted like a lightning strike. The land corruption case dominated the news across the state of Montana. The public learned the truth about the secret contracts and the bribes. They saw the names of the powerful men who had tried to sell the wilderness for profit. The perpetrators were brought to justice one by one. The headlines did not just talk about the crime. They talked about Sam Miller. The man who had been labeled as a recluse and a failure was finally seen for who he truly was. The state government issued a formal apology to the Miller family. Sam Miller was posthumously honored as a hero of the Montana environment. A permanent conservation easement was placed over the entire Bitterroot Valley. It ensured that no drill or bulldozer would ever touch those peaks. Thomas Sterling watched the news on the small television in his room. A single tear tracked through the deep wrinkles on his face. He had waited 3 decades to see this day. He had lived in shadows and fear to fulfill a promise made to a friend. "We did it, Sam," Thomas whispered to the quiet room. He finally found a peace that had been absent for 30 long years. A few days later, Jax returned to the mine site with a team of state geologists. They conducted a final survey of the Sterling vein. The lead geologist shook his head as he looked at the shattered white quartz. "It is empty," the man said. "There are traces of gold, but the vein was depleted long ago. There is nothing here but rock." Jax looked at the towering pines and the crystal-clear streams of the valley below. He looked at the eagles circling the summit of the Devil's Finger. "You are wrong," Jax said quietly. "The treasure is still here. It is everywhere you look." He realized then that the gold was just a shield. His father had used the legend of the mine to draw the greed of the world away from the true prize. The gold was a lie, but the forest was the truth, and the forest was safe. Jax walked back to his truck. Buster was waiting for him in the passenger seat. The dog looked older in the bright light of day, but his amber eyes were clear and steady. Jax climbed in and started the engine. The rhythmic hum of the truck was the only sound in the vast silence of the mountains. He reached over and touched the leather journal on the dashboard. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a miller, and his father's honor had finally come home. Chapter 7. Dawn on Devil's Finger. The harsh white grip of winter finally began to loosen its hold on the Bitterroot Mountains. In the valley below, the frozen rivers transformed into a rhythmic and rushing melody of crystal water. The arrival of spring felt different from all the seasons before. It was a time of rebirth that was not just in the trees, but in the hearts of the men who lived among them. Jackson Miller stood on the wide timber porch of his cabin. He was no longer the shadow that haunted the tree line. Beside him, Thomas Sterling sat in a sturdy cedar rocking chair. The old man looked stronger now. His skin had taken on a healthy glow from the mountain sun. Together, they watched the Bitterroot Valley bloom in a sea of wild lupine and bitterroot flowers. The cabin was no longer a place of silence and isolation. From the meadow below, the sound of rhythmic whistles and human commands drifted up the slope. Jax had opened the Miller Mountain Rescue and Search Dog Center. He had turned his home into a sanctuary for training the next generation of responders. He taught them how to read the mountain. He taught them how to respect the fire. But most importantly, he taught them how to listen to the animals. Jax looked down at the floorboards near his boots. Buster lay there in a patch of warm sunlight. The great wolf dog was very old now. His muzzle was almost entirely white. His breathing was a slow and peaceful rhythm. Buster had completed his journey. He had carried a secret across 3 decades of wilderness. He had endured the wire and the cold to find the one soul who could finish the mission. Now, the mission was over. The loyal messenger had finally found his rest. Jax knelt down beside the dog. He felt the familiar coarse texture of the silver fur. "You did it, partner," Jax whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of tarnished brass. It was his father's original dog tag from many years ago. Jax carefully threaded the metal tag onto Buster's heavy leather collar. It clicked softly against the other brass plate. It was more than a tag. It was a medal of honor. It was a symbol of a bond that time and death could not break. Buster opened one amber eye. He looked at the tag. Then he looked at Jax. The dog let out a deep and contented sigh. He rested his heavy chin on Jax's boot. Thomas watched them from his chair. He nodded slowly. "Your father is watching. Jax. He sees that the valley is safe. And he sees that his son is finally home." Jax stood up and looked toward the jagged spire of the Devil's Finger. The mountain no longer looked like a tomb or a place of secrets. It looked like a monument. Jax realized the great truth of his life. Sometimes, a man must be brave enough to walk back into the fire of his past. He must face the heat and the smoke of his old wounds, because it is only in the center of that fire that the light of the future is forged. He had spent 10 years running from the flames, only to find that the fire was where his strength had always been hidden. A high and piercing cry echoed from the sky. Jax looked up. A pair of golden eagles circled the highest peak of the finger. They soared on the rising thermal winds. Their wings were steady and wide. They were the guardians of a land that was finally free. The land corruption was gone. The greed was buried. The legacy of Sam Miller was as permanent as the granite beneath their feet. Jax stepped off the porch and onto the grass. Buster stood up slowly. He followed Jax with a steady and proud gait. They walked toward the edge of the meadow where the forest began. The sun began to set behind the western ridges. It painted the sky in shades of deep violet and burning gold. The silhouettes of the man and the dog stood tall against the glowing horizon. They were 2 survivors, 2 partners, 2 parts of a single story. The wind blew softly through the pines. It carried the scent of fresh earth and new growth. Peace had returned to the bitter roots, and Jackson Miller was no longer afraid of the dawn. The journey of Jax and Buster reminds us that the bonds of loyalty are never truly broken by time or distance. Sometimes, life requires us to walk through the fire of our past to find the peace we deserve in our future. If this story of sacrifice and silent devotion touched your heart today, please consider supporting our work by subscribing and sharing this legacy of love with others. We would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. Now, please click the video appearing on your screen to join us for our next moving journey into the heart of the great wilderness.